thank you for coming back and pulling you away from your sustenance to keep you going. I know this is a long session, so thank you for your patience and had a lot to learn from our fellow panelists here. One of the things that I wanted to kind of talk about and break it into, I look at it and break it into three different realms, but one of them is incentives. And David was really involved with DOE during the formation of policy, likely the implementation, and so I think that you have a very interesting perspective on that. And then also from the China perspective, I'm wondering, given the more recent resurgence of EVs, when the president makes the goal they want 5 million nets by 2020, I guess where does that number originate from? Is it tied to climate change? Is it tied to any specific type of goal that helps the consumers and the population of your country understand sort of why we're going where we're going and what are the different elements that come into play when we're trying to achieve a certain number of nets on the road by X date?
这个中国政府制定了一个就是长期的这个电动车这个推广计划，那么在2020年要推广电动车的500万辆，那么500万辆这个数额实际上是政府它做了一个详细的这个5年这么一个计划。那这个基于这个我们在全国各个省市，每个省市都提到了一个自己的一个电动车的一个推广这种计划。那么在一个具有一定的考虑现实，又考虑具有一定的挑战性的基础的一个目标。这个中国政府把推行电动汽车是作为一个国家战略来提出来的。为什么这个背后有一个思考是，一个是因为主要是两方面，一个是这个减少这个空气污染，保护环境，这也是一个方面。另外一个是因为随着中国的这种经济发展，那么它的这个对能源的这种适应依存度是越来越高。那么最新的数据。这个中国目前的这个经济发展的这个 GDP 的增长，石油依存度已经是超过了60%。那如果要是按这么一个发展速度，未来就是中国对石油的这种依赖程度也越来越高。那么为了这种减少对石油依存度，那么中国政府是希望能够大力推广纯电动的电动汽车，来减少这个国家经济发展对石油依存度。这是国家把它作为一个国家战略来推行这个电动车的背后的一个思考。那么基于这种作为国家战略提出这种的战略思考了，所以国家也详细的制定了5年之内如何利用各种的政策发展电动车这个产业，并且有这个详细的就是提出来这个500万辆这样的一个事情。谢谢。
Great answer. So with that, I mean, when you develop this coherent plan, how do you, I mean, in the U.S. especially, more so with the political winds shifting, how do you maintain that balance of continuing forward with a really great strategic plan, but also kind of backtracking and saying, okay, we did this strategy with the E project, what worked there, what didn't work? Now we have a new administration, we're trying to bookend the current administration on the next. How do you maintain predictability for the market and also progress?
It's a really great question, Ashley, and it points to one of the most important differences between policymaking in China and the United States. As we've just heard, China has a 5-year planning process. The Chinese leadership will often adopt long-term goals. 5 million new energy vehicles by 2020 is one of them. I've also read about a goal of 3 million new energy vehicles a year being sold by 2025 as another goal of the federal government. And of course, China Chinese government has goals similar to that in a variety of different sectors. We don't do that in the United States. We have much more chaotic policy making in the United States. I think many Americans wish that we had a long-term policy planning process like that. For example, our federal tax credit for the purchase of electric vehicles doesn't result from any specific long-term plan. It really results from a certain political moment when the forces were aligned on Capitol Hill and they were able to come together to actually pass legislation, which is something our Congress doesn't do very often. And so that's a legacy now that stays with us. Actually, in 2008, but even before he was president, Barack Obama, during his political campaign, he announced a goal of 1 million electric vehicles on the roads of the United States by 2015. And that was the goal. And once he became president, he decided to reaffirm that goal, and he did his best to push forward policies to reach it. But he didn't have the cooperation of the Congress. And the Congress, our Congress decided if Barack Obama is for it, we're against it. And so they didn't pass legislation that he proposed to help us get there, and the United States fell short of that goal. I think the United States, despite the negative things I've just said, the United States has a lot of very favorable policy related to electric vehicles to help promote the adoption of this technology. It includes the federal tax credit. It includes some support from the Department of Energy in terms of technical supports. It includes a lot of state policies that a number of us spoke about, the Bureau of the ZEV program, preferential access to high occupancy vehicle lanes, but they actually don't result from a single coherent policy. And in my opinion, in our country, we do better if we had a single comprehensive policy, and we were able to then adopt subsequent policies as a result of it. There isn't much of that. Just one final point on this. The current Secretary of Energy in the United States, Secretary Ernest Moniz, has recognized this as a gap and has adopted something called the Quadrennial Energy Review Process, which is an attempt to do some type of long-term energy planning in the United States. And it's still pretty in the early stage of that process, but it's, I think, part of his goal to be able to do that. He hasn't done that specifically for electric vehicles yet, but I think that could be a lot of growth in this process.
Ashley, can I just chime in on that real quick? Because what David says is so important and it's so true. And I just want to include one additional thing and one very short story. The thing is that there is somewhere that does this in the United States for electric vehicles, and that's the state of California. And the state of California is very methodical in the way that they try to push manufacturers to the limit in deploying these new technologies. And they do that over the course of decades, and they have a long strategic vision, which Washington does not, unfortunately. And the story gets back to what David said about this special time in history when people were able to come together from both sides of the aisle. I interviewed someone for my book who was part of that moment, and what he told me is there was just a group of staffers who kind of got interested in the idea of electric vehicles, and they said, we think that this could happen, but it's going to need some sort of government support. And one of them said, well, how about we push for a tax credit? I said, sure, that sounds great. You think your boss would be on with that? I said, yeah, I think so. So they went back, they talked to their bosses, and they said, yeah, we could do some tax credit. And they said, how big should we make the tax credit? And they decided, well, 10,000 is probably too much, and 5,000 is probably too little. So they came up with the very scientifically arrived at number of 7,500, which was between 10,000 and 5,000. And that just shows you how chaotic and, in some ways sloppy policy making can be on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. So complete agreement with David, and just like to add a little bit of color there.
Just by the way, everybody here should buy and read Levi's book, in which he talks about the zero electric vehicle program in California. It has a very good description.
Yeah, I think so off of that chaos theory, it is sort of a shame how many things come to fruition just out of that. And we have how many national labs and all of these really intelligent heavyweights, I think we're going to do 7,500.
Okay, I'm sorry to jump in, I don't want to say too much, but actually, I'm glad you mentioned the U.S. Department of Energy National Lab, because they do a lot of really important research. One piece of policy, which we haven't mentioned yet, and I probably should have mentioned in my remarks, is that the U.S. Department of Energy spends hundreds of millions of dollars every year doing research in this area and pushing the frontiers on technological innovation. It's a very important investment that we're making, not just for our country, but for the world in this technology.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because I've seen the pie chart from Jake Ward at DOE and how much gets spent on outreach, and I think that's an important distinction. So one of the things I had read or seen something you had said previously, Levi, a Chinese proverb I wrote down here, the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. I don't know how known that is, but I thought that was really interesting, and I kind of wonder if you could answer a little bit about the incentive piece and the Fed setting national policy, and ideally that would be great, but it's largely provincial in that congressmen and women want to report back to where their voters, voted them in office. So in saying that, you mentioned California, and then we did the ZEV action plan. And so back in 2013, I was one of the 8 people that were up on stage, Mary Nichols from California, and we talked about drafting the ZEV action plan. It wasn't legally binding, but it did create 11 states that came together and basically said, here's what we think is important to advance electric vehicles. How do you kind of take an action plan like that and see how is it enforced, number one? Is it relevant if it's not legally binding or some type of federally mandated provision? Or do you think, like China, if they set a standard and then the provinces kind of get created and make it somewhat self-serving? Hopefully I'm asking this question correctly, but I'm wondering if you can kind of compare China and the U.S. in terms of the provinces and how they make decisions and what's the benefit to state-led planning versus federal planning.
Well, people always say the states are the laboratories of democracy, but I think your question really gets at a deeper issue, which is the difference between industrial policy, sort of methodical, strategic, industry-focused government push, and political policy and regulatory policy. And we have all 3 of those different kinds of policy making in the United States. What David and I were just discussing with the tax credit, that is a political policy that sort of resulted from this weird convergence of events. Then there's regulatory policy, and actually the EPA is pretty good at long-term planning because they have a technocratic body of employees, and they have fairly strong regulatory tools at their disposal that they can use for things like the greenhouse gas emissions rules. And those are actually going to be increasingly important to driving electrification in the U.S. market going forward, especially in the years 2018, 2019, and beyond, because those standards are really going to start to bite. And then the final kind of policymaking is industrial policy, and that's using incentives and research and development and other things like that to try to create new industries and target sunrise industries and help them grow and build your employment base in these industries. And you can see different countries around the world tend to gravitate towards different kinds of policies. In the United States, we do a lot of regulatory policy. China does more industrial policy, though they do some regulatory policy as well. Japan loves the industrial policy, not so hot on the regulatory policy. And California is this sort of interesting part of America that is incredibly powerful, the 6th largest economy in the world. They have this interesting authority that allows them to set their own standards for emissions, and functionally it gives them control over about 30% of the U.S. auto market, which in all practicality kind of gives them control over the U.S. auto market, because you're not going to build cars for just 30% of the United States. And they are very good at long-term strategic industrial/regulatory policy type planning. They're very sophisticated and they hybridize those 2 elements. And the nice thing for California, and the reason they're able to do this, is that the politics aren't really in question. There's a social consensus in the state that these issues are important, and you don't find that on the national level.
the social consensus piece is a really good point, and that kind of sets me up for my question for you, Wei. When you did your analysis on the incentives and the efficacy of each of the incentives in the different regions, and then how, like in Denver, for example, they have so many different incentives in Colorado, but they don't have the uptick of adoption. One of the things that I have a theory about is just the awareness of incentives, and who is that tool that disseminates the existence of these incentives. DOE has a really great online tool. The dealers, there's some dealers that are better than others, but to me, it doesn't seem like there's a really great system, and I'm wondering if you noted any of that in your research, if you can speak to that a little bit more. And maybe even a question for BAIC on the China market, all of these incentives that you have, how do you parlay that, and how do you reach the population that doesn't have an EV? So it's kind of a two-part question, but if you could cover the first part about the awareness.
Yeah, I'll try. In the US studies, in that bar chart, actually we group all the consumer outreach type of policies into others. But we did realize that the outreach program at local level really can play a role. And in some states, well, this is interlinked with how complicated the policy is. So first of all, your dealers needs to be able to explain all the benefits very clearly to the consumers, because they are the first ones that talk to the consumers when they come to buy vehicles. And also the government, some government also leads this consumer campaign using various type of media. They also work with utility companies to provide the similar information. I think the combination of the private sector, the government, can really make a difference of the outreach to consumers.
And have you seen any particular incentives or approach to communicating the availability of incentives in China that has been particularly moving in terms of inducing electric vehicle purchases in your company?
好，这个在中国实际上是在激励政策方面，政府的政策方面有各种各样的。首先就是有在就是购车消费者这个购车，那么有资金补贴。那么另外呢，还有就是为了支持这个新能源电动车的产业发展，那么在就是减免购车的这个税收这方面的政策。另外还现在不同城市也出台了有一些就是我电动汽车这个免收这种过路过桥费啊什么这种公共这种费用，包括现在还有一个免收这种城市室内这种停车费。那么像北京这样的城市，北京、上海这样的城市，由于就是车辆比较多，那么它是对传统车实行了这种限行的这个，也就是说一周其中有2个号是必须是停驶1天，但是对于电动车来说就是可以不受这个限制。就类似这样的这个一系列的这个措施，都是政府就是或者支持和鼓励，就是它在电动车方面做出一些政策规定。刚才谈到了就是虽然中国政府是把这个电动车产业作为一个国家战略来讲，但是各个省份，就是刚才谈到这个题目是各个省份实际上也有不同的这个自己的这个就是鼓励电动车发展的这个政策在中国。但是总的来说是各个省这种的支持力度和这个电动车的这个产业发展也是不平衡的。那么多数应该是在经济发达地区，还有这种特大城市，就是这种电动车，由于人们这个环保理念也好，或者是购车的这种行为，这个加强政府的这种扶持力度，那么在这些领域应该就是这个发展比较快。那么在经济欠发达的地区，也在进行推广，但是这个现在的这个数目要比这个发达地区要差一些，也存在这种不同的这个情况。当然刚才谈到了就是中美之间就是实际上是有很多我觉得是 很多政策方面的一些互相可学习借鉴的地方。比如说是这个加州推出的这个电动车的这种补贴政策，那么现在在中国国内包括政府层面，包括就是我们就是北京市专门现在是跟加州建立这种友好在电动车产业方面的友好合作关系。那么其中非常有名的是引入这个加州正在推出的这个碳排放这个交易这个方法，那么现在也全面的引入到这个中国国内，并且把它在这种类似这样的政策这个转化成中国国内的这种碳排放的这种交易政策以后呢，是预计可能会在明年在全国开始试行，只要你就是生产电动车和买电动车的，就是可以做这个碳排放进行交易。这就是一个我觉得中美在电动车产业方面就是合作的非常非常好的一个例子。
I'm going to push you a little bit. I'm going to push you a little bit because I still feel like I don't have the answer of how you have all these incentives. How do people, before they come to purchase the car, how do they know, like, where are they getting the information? How do they know that there's these, they can lessen the wait time for the license plate? Is there a central source? Is it just, are they learning about it from other people that they live by? Because I just keep coming back to the question in the US and China, or just elsewhere. As a consumer and as somebody who knows other people who are considering purchasing a car, which only happens in the US every 10 to 11 years on average, how are people getting that information before they decide to purchase a car? Is there a central source in China or fragments? I think if we could solve this, it might help.
好，就是关于这些政策，作为消费者如何去尽快的知道，并且能够享受到这样的政策，应该是有多种渠道的。首先，国家颁布这样的政策，它会在政府网站上直接就把这些政策公布出来。那么公布出来，实际上是每一个人都可以上政府的网站去了解到、知道这个政策推出。另外一个呢，在整个的这个新闻媒体。那么类似这样的对老百姓有利好的这种政策出台以后，新闻媒体也会做大量的各种用不同方式的一个宣传报道。那么作为企业端，就生产企业端，那么呢这种政策出台以后呢，我们会通过终端的这个销售渠道向消费者去这个介绍解释这样的政策如何能惠及老百姓并且协助他们。能够享受到这样的政策。
I think to complement on that, I'd say the most effective driving policies in China are perhaps the license plate restriction and also the road restriction. For these things, you just can't avoid seeing them every day, everywhere. They announce the next day restriction, the license numbers on CCTV, central television, on the news times. You just can't avoid those. And it's on the daily newspaper, on all the newspaper every day. The first important thing, air quality, of course, weather forecast, air quality, and restricted emissions. So it's just a naturally part of your life.
And it's so ubiquitous that it's not just Chinese people living there who know about it. The foreigners know the details of China's electric car policy when you go to China. And I have friends over there who have spent a long time puzzling over, oh, should I buy an electric car? So I think that the policies are pretty well known in China. And then, of course, they're done on a city level a lot of the time. So you can't necessarily put them all together into a single basket. And then the final thing I would say on that is that sometimes policymaking in China is a little bit different than it is in the United States. Here we live in a very legalistic society. Everything has to be announced in advance. Everything has to be written down on paper. If for some reason the government is doing something that doesn't accord exactly with someone's interpretation of what has been written down on paper, they can then be sued. for not doing what they said they were going to do on paper. And in China, it's pretty different. Sometimes policies are sort of announced the middle of the year, and they say, okay, now we have to catch up to make sure that we reach our goal, even though you didn't know this policy existed for the first 6 months of the year. And so a lot of policy is done in practice in China, whereas in the United States, and this makes our system less efficient sometimes, you have to write it down.
So shifting a little bit to past incentives to technology, I was reading something you said, Levi, about in your your discussion about the quest to build the car of the future, just kind of depicting the fierce competition not only between countries to try to be the first out of the gate, the competition between automakers, but yet we're sort of in this industry. I can't imagine the oil or the car companies in the past having forums like ad nauseum like we do with EVs on incentives. Maybe they did, maybe I just wasn't aware of them. But I'm wondering, how do we take that competition and turn that into something that can kind of allow us to get further along quicker? And then the second part to that question, besides the competition, is the fact that technology is moving so quickly, and it doesn't seem like the current fleet of automakers can really respond as quickly as they need to. Maybe like BAIC was able to shift their thinking about their business model. How do we navigate through that current situation?
Well, people have to be able to make money in this space. And so one of the benefits of the ZEV mandate is they created this synthetic market, which allowed some people who invested early in electric vehicles to make quite a bit of money by selling credits. And currently I think that it's still hard to make money on electric vehicles. And part of that is ecosystem problem. As I mentioned earlier, you can't really make money on electric vehicle charging infrastructure. It's just really hard to make money on EV charging infrastructure. And that's a big obstacle to deployment. And so what you need systems that channel the force of these incredibly large and sophisticated entities whose primary goal is, by the way, making money towards the end of producing electric vehicles, right? And selling electric vehicles. And that's why policy is so important to this sector, and it has been very important up until now. But I think when you look at 2019 and 2020, we're going to be looking at a market that is much more driven by the economics. I think we will have solved, or at least somewhat ameliorated some of the issues around charging. And finally, you're going to see this tipping point to a place where EVs are driven by economics, not by government policy.
Do you have any insight or
I think one of the most interesting competitions we're going to see in this space is between Tesla and GM, the Tesla Model 3 versus the Chevy Volt. And a lot of people here know that you follow it. And Tesla announced the Model 3 and got 400,000 advanced orders with that. And you know, the good thing about the car is it's cheap, it's got great handling, and the only problem with it is it doesn't exist. And so Tesla has said, we're prepared to sell 400,000 of them, and now they just got to figure out how to make them. And so GM has stepped in the space and said, well, we have a car that has a significant advantage. It does exist, and it's available for sale starting in a couple of months. And historically, Tesla has been a much hotter brand. GM has not been known in the past as the leader of innovation, although I think we hope that's changing. So that's going to be a very interesting competition in this space. And I think the whole electric vehicle charging area is another hugely fascinating area right now. Because Levi is exactly right. It's really hard to make money in that area. But using conventional business models, using the business model of the classic retail gasoline vendor, it's really hard to make money. But that's why all these companies are exploring different models. I guess you work for Snap. But some of the electric vehicle charging companies have raised a significant amount of capital, venture capital, and so there are some investors out there who think there's a profitable business model out there. And as we go through the different evolutions in this industry in the years ahead, we'll see which ones succeed.
So I'm going to tie up my questions and then hopefully leave some time for everyone to ask what I'm sure are really great questions. To tie that up, I guess my point to the competition between the GM and the Tesla, I would say the biggest difference is Tesla has a massive network of charging. The GM has continued to say that they're not necessarily going. So I wonder what your perspective on that is from BAIC's perspective, and it seems like you guys understand that you need to release charging infrastructure in parallel with the actual vehicle. And how do you see the balance of continuously improving your technology in the car to please the consumer in terms of options, range, battery improvement, quicker charging with the need to refuel? And keeping up with that technology as well, because the technology for charging is also rapidly changing.
好，这个是就是作为这个刚才谈到这个传统车和the question is comparison between the traditional car and the EV car, the time, right?
Right.
Okay. 谈到这个